The Greyhound bus rolled west through Manitoba with the steady, sleepy rhythm of an overnight run. Inside, the air smelled faintly of diesel and warm fabric. Passengers slumped in their seats with headphones on, eyes closed, bags tucked under their legs. Near the back, Timothy McLean leaned against the window, dozing as the highway lights flickered past in long, pale streaks. McLean was 22, heading home to Winnipeg after working with a carnival in Edmonton. He had boarded Greyhound Canada bus 1170 for the long ride east, expecting nothing worse than stiff legs and bad coffee at the stops. Late that afternoon, at a stop in Erickson, Manitoba, a tall man with a shaved head and sunglasses got on and took a seat near the front. His name was Vincent Weiguang Lee. Nobody on the bus knew him, and at first there was nothing about him that seemed to demand attention. After a later stop in Brandon, Lee moved toward the back and sat beside McLean. McLean barely acknowledged him. He kept his headphones on, turned slightly toward the glass, and fell asleep again, the way you did on buses when you trusted the driver and the road to carry you where you needed to go. Not long after, passengers heard a sound that didn't belong in the quiet. A sharp thud followed by a gasp. A man looked up and saw Lee bent toward McLean, his arm moving in short, forceful motions. For a second, the witness couldn't understand what he was seeing. Then he saw the knife, and he saw McLean's body jerk, trapped against the window, headphones still on, as if the music might somehow keep the moment from being real. Screams ripped through the aisle. People stumbled over bags, pushing toward the front. The driver, hearing the commotion, pulled the bus onto the shoulder of the Trans-Canada Highway, roughly 30 kilometers west of Portage-la-Prairie. He opened the door, and passengers poured out into the evening wind, some crying, some vomiting, some staring back at the windows like they couldn't believe what they'd escaped. Outside, the driver and two men tried to help McLean. They stepped toward the door, shouting and waving, hoping to distract Lee long enough to pull the victim away. Lee rushed them instead, slashing toward the opening and forcing them back. Someone managed to lock the bus. From the roadside, terrified passengers watched through the glass as Lee remained inside with McLean. Before police arrived, the roadside became its own camp of fear. People stood barefoot or in socks because they had fled without thinking, leaving shoes and jackets on the bus. Some held each other up as shock settled in. When headlights swept past on the highway, a few flinched, expecting the bus door to burst open. When officers established a perimeter, they ordered everyone back from the windows. The tactical team waited for the right moment, knowing a rushed entry could cost more lives. Inside, Lee moved through the aisle with an eerie calm, acting as if the bus belonged to him now. Calls went out to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Officers from Portage-la-Prairie arrived to find a scene that felt unreal. A stranded coach on the shoulder, passengers huddled in shock, and a lone suspect still inside, pacing. The standoff stretched on. Police brought in negotiators and a tactical team. Witnesses reported seeing Lee mutilate McLean's body and eat parts of it while officers watched from outside, unable to safely rush the bus without risking more lives. At one point, officers heard Lee say, "I have to stay on the bus forever." A truck driver who stopped to help handed over a crowbar and a hammer, and he and the driver positioned themselves to keep Lee from escaping. When Lee tried to start the bus, the driver had already activated an emergency immobilizer, leaving it inoperable. Hours passed under the harsh light of patrol cars. Passengers were taken away to be interviewed at the Brandon RCMP detachment, many of them still shaking so hard they couldn't hold a cup of water. Just after 1:30 in the morning on July 31st, Lee attempted to break out through a window. Officers moved in. He was hit with a taser, handcuffed, and taken into custody. Police recovered plastic bags with body parts from the bus, and additional remains were found on Lee. Some parts were never recovered. The next day, Greyhound representatives brought the stranded passengers to replace the clothes they had left behind. Many arrived in Winnipeg hours later, exhausted and hollow, walking into reunions that didn't feel like relief because the images were still stuck in their heads. For McLean's family, there was no return trip, no goodbye. There was only a call that split time into before and after. In the days that followed, Canada tried to process what had happened on a public highway in full view of witnesses. McLean's loved ones faced the sudden horror of losing him, and his girlfriend was pregnant with their child. The story reached every corner of the country, and it was hard for people to speak about it without their voices tightening around the worst details. The criminal case moved quickly because the central facts weren't in dispute. In March 2009, the court found Lee not criminally responsible on account of mental disorder. Psychiatrists testified that he had schizophrenia and did not understand the nature of his actions at the time, believing delusions that McLean was a threat and that God had commanded him. Instead of prison, Lee was committed to a high-security psychiatric facility at Selkirk Mental Health Center in Manitoba. For McLean's family, the verdict felt like a second blow. For others, it became a test of how a justice system should respond when a killing was driven by severe mental illness. Over the years, review boards granted Lee increasing freedoms as doctors reported he was responding to treatment. He was allowed supervised outings, later moved to less restrictive living arrangements, and in 2015, he was released from the hospital under conditions. In the aftermath, Greyhound Canada pulled an ad campaign that used the slogan, "There's a reason you've never heard of bus rage." The case also sparked calls for better safety measures on long-distance buses, barriers, alarms, and clearer emergency protocols, because passengers had been trapped in a narrow aisle with nowhere to run once the attack began. In 2017, the Manitoba Review Board granted Lee an absolute discharge, ending supervision entirely after concluding he no longer posed a significant threat to public safety. Reports later noted he had changed his name to Will Baker. The decision reignited national debate about bus security, mental health treatment, and what accountability could mean when the killer was also profoundly ill. The stretch of highway near Portage-la-Prairie looked the same after the tow trucks and police left. But for those who had been on bus 1170, it never returned to ordinary. Some passengers reported lasting trauma. Greyhound faced lawsuits and renewed calls for protections for drivers and riders. Across Canada, the case became a reference point, an event people cited when they talked about fear on public transit, gaps in mental health care, and the thin line between a routine trip and a nightmare. Tim McLean's death did not come with a motive that made human sense. It came with the suddenness of a stranger's delusion colliding with an unprotected space. And it left behind a family, a child who would grow up without him, and a country still arguing about what justice should look like when the crime was as brutal as it was incomprehensible. Thank you for listening to Homicide Files. Subscribe for more true crime stories.